There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They knock on your door on a Tuesday night, wearing a familiar face and carrying the weight of a simple, unassuming question. You don't recognize them as architecture, as the load-bearing walls of your future being erected in the quiet of your own hallway. You just see a friend in need, and you open the door. You always open the door. For him, I always opened the door. That night, the air was thick with the smell of rain that had been threatening for hours but had never quite committed to falling. A heavy, indecisive humidity that clung to everything. He stood on my welcome mat, framed by the weak yellow light of the porch bulb, and he looked like a ship that had lost its anchor. His shoulders, usually so broad and confident, were slumped in a way that made my own chest ache in sympathy. He wasn't looking at me, not directly, but at a point somewhere over my shoulder, as if the space behind me held an answer he was desperate to find. His name was Julian, and for 6 years, he had been the unwavering constant in the chaotic equation of my life. He was the North Star I navigated by, the steady rhythm beneath the noise. And on that Tuesday night, the rhythm was gone. His own internal metronome had faltered, and the silence it left behind was deafening. He finally lifted his eyes to meet mine, and I saw the exhaustion etched into the lines around them, a deep, weary sorrow that seemed to have settled into his very bones. He had a key to my apartment. He'd had one for years, a worn brass key on his own ring, nestled between the one for his car and the one for his own front door. He never used it without calling first, a small courtesy that had become a cornerstone of our mutual respect, a quiet acknowledgement of the boundary between his life and mine. But tonight he had knocked. The sound had echoed through my small, quiet space, a formal request for entry that felt more significant than any time he had just let himself in. "Leo," he said, and my name was a fragile thing in his mouth, barely a whisper. He cleared his throat, a rough, scraping sound. "Can I?" He stopped, his gaze dropping to the worn floorboards between us. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I knew was born of pure, unadulterated anxiety. It was the same thing he did before a big presentation at work or when he was trying to figure out how to tell his parents bad news. It was his tell, the physical manifestation of a mind racing to find the right words and coming up empty. I waited. Patience was the language I spoke most fluently with Julian. I had learned over the years that he processed his world externally, that he needed to talk things through, to pace and gesture and map out his thoughts in the air. I was his sounding board, his quiet harbor. My role was to provide the silence, the calm water where he could see his own reflection clearly. So I waited, leaning against the doorframe, my hands tucked into my pockets to keep from reaching out to him, to keep from pulling him into a hug that might say too much, that might cross a line I had so carefully drawn and redrawn for more than half a decade. "Can I just stay here tonight?" He finally managed, the words tumbling out in a rush, as if they would disintegrate if he held on to them for a second longer. "On the couch. I can't be in my apartment right now. It's too quiet. It's too loud. I don't know." I didn't need to ask why. I knew why. Clara was why. Clara, his girlfriend of 4 years, the woman I had always assumed he would marry, was gone. Their relationship, a sprawling, intricate thing I had observed from the sidelines for years, had finally collapsed under its own weight a week ago. And in its place was this gaping silence that was apparently so vast and so terrifying that it had driven him here, to my doorstep, seeking refuge. "Of course," I said, and the answer was out of my mouth before the question had fully settled in the air. Of course. There was no other possible response. I stepped back, pulling the door wider, a silent invitation. He shuffled inside, bringing the scent of damp earth and his own particular brand of tired sorrow with him. He moved like a man twice his age, his feet dragging slightly on the hardwood floor. He didn't look around my apartment, a space as familiar to him as his own, but instead fixed his gaze on the large, comfortable couch that dominated my living room. It was as if that piece of furniture was a life raft, the only solid thing in a churning sea of emotional chaos. I watched him drop his messenger bag by the door with a heavy thud, the sound echoing the weight that had settled in my own stomach. This was the moment. The ordinary Tuesday that was not ordinary at all. It was the beginning of the end of the world we had known, and the start of a new one I was completely unprepared to navigate. It was the moment the door I had always kept so carefully closed began to creak open, and I was terrified of what might be waiting on the other side. To understand that night, you have to understand all the nights that came before it. You have to understand the architecture of our friendship, a structure built slowly and meticulously over 6 years. We met in a black and white photography class our junior year of college. It was an elective for him, a required course for me. He was a software engineering major, a creature of logic and code, of clean lines and binary certainties. I was an art major, a resident of the gray areas, of shadows and light, and the infinite spectrum of emotions that lived between them. He was there because he thought it would be an easy a creative outlet that required little more than pointing a camera and clicking a button. He learned on the first day, during the lecture on aperture and shutter speed, that he was profoundly mistaken. I remember watching him from across the classroom, a frown of intense concentration on his face as he tried to load a roll of film onto a developing reel in the pitch black of the changing bag. I could hear his frustrated sighs, the quiet rattle of the plastic reel as he fumbled with the delicate film. I had been doing this for years. The motion was second nature to me, my fingers finding their way in the dark with an easy familiarity. I finished my own roll, and, on an impulse I still don't fully understand, I reached over in the darkness and said, "Here, let me." My voice was quiet, but in the focused silence of the lab, it sounded like a shout. He startled, his hand bumping against mine. A tiny spark of static electricity jumped between us. A brief, surprising jolt. "Sorry," he mumbled, his voice a low rumble in the dark. "It's okay," I whispered back. "You have to feed it in from the outside edge. Feel for the 2 little ball bearings. That's where it starts." I guided his hands with my own, my fingertips brushing against his knuckles. His hands were warm and solid, the hands of someone who built things. In the anonymous intimacy of the total darkness, I showed him how to coax the slippery film into the grooves of the reel. When it was finally loaded, he let out a long, slow breath of relief. "Thanks," he said, and I could hear the genuine gratitude in his voice. I thought I was going to be in here all night. That was the beginning. We were an unlikely pair. Julian was all bright energy and easy laughter, the kind of person who collected friends like other people collected stamps. He moved through the world with an unshakable confidence that I found both intimidating and fascinating. I was quiet, an observer by nature and by trade. My camera was a shield, a way to be a part of the world without having to be fully in it. I preferred the solitude of the darkroom, the alchemical magic of watching an image slowly emerge from a blank sheet of paper submerged in a chemical bath. It was a process of patience and revelation, of waiting for something hidden to make itself known. It was, in many ways, how I approached everything in my life. Our friendship developed like one of my photographs. It started with a faint outline, a ghost of an image. We'd nod to each other in class. He'd ask for my help with a stubborn roll of film. I'd ask him to explain a concept from our physics requirement that made my head spin. Then, the details began to fill in. We started studying together in the library, his laptop covered in complex lines of code sitting next to my stacks of art history books. We found a shared language in our disparate worlds. He would talk about the elegance of a well-written algorithm, the beautiful, invisible structure that made a program run seamlessly. I would talk about composition, about the golden ratio, the invisible lines that guided the viewer's eye and created a sense of harmony in a photograph. We were both searching for the same thing, really, a kind of hidden order in the chaos of the world. It was during one of those late-night study sessions that I realized the nature of my feelings for him had begun to shift, to deepen into something more complicated than friendship. He was trying to explain some esoteric programming concept to me, using sugar packets and coffee stirs on the table to illustrate his point. He was so animated, so passionate. His eyes lit up with an infectious enthusiasm. And in the middle of his explanation, he stopped and looked at me, a wide, unguarded smile spreading across his face. "Are you getting any of this?" he asked, laughing. And in that moment, bathed in the fluorescent hum of the near-empty library, my heart did a strange, painful lurch in my chest. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated clarity. I was in love with him. The realization didn't feel like a sudden revelation. It felt more like finally noticing something that had been there all along, like looking at a familiar photograph and seeing a detail in the background you'd never noticed before, a detail that changed the meaning of the entire image. My friendship with Julian was the photograph, and my love for him was the hidden detail. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. It colored everything. Of course, there was Clara. He met her a few months after our photography class ended. She was bright and funny and ambitious, a perfect match for his energy. Seeing them together was like watching two perfectly tuned instruments playing in harmony. It was beautiful, and it was excruciating. I became a master of a particular kind of emotional alchemy, learning to transmute the sharp pang of jealousy into a dull, manageable ache of platonic affection. I learned to smile when he talked about her, to offer advice when they fought, to be the stable, supportive friend he needed. I built a room inside myself where I kept my feelings for him locked away. It was a quiet, dimly lit space, and I rarely went inside. But I always knew it was there. The door was always closed, but I was always aware of what was behind it. Our friendship deepened even as his relationship with Clara blossomed. I became his confidant, the one he came to when he needed to vent or celebrate or simply exist without the pressure of being one half of a couple. We helped each other move into our first post-college apartments. I took the professional headshots for his LinkedIn profile. He helped me set up my website to showcase my photography portfolio. We fell into a comfortable rhythm of weekly dinners, of lazy Sunday afternoons spent watching bad movies, of text messages sent at all hours of the night sharing a funny meme or a moment of frustration. He was woven into the very fabric of my daily life. He was my person, and for 6 years, I was content with that, or I told myself I was. I had his friendship, and it was more than enough. It had to be. To risk that for the faint, impossible hope of something more would have been the height of foolishness. So I kept the door to that room inside me firmly shut, and I learned to live with the quiet hum of what was locked behind it. I never imagined that he would be the one to come knocking on it. The shift began subtly, a change in barometric pressure before a storm. The catalyst was, of course, the end of his relationship with Clara. It wasn't a dramatic, explosive breakup, but a slow, sad erosion. From my vantage point, I had seen it coming for months. The way he talked about her changed. The easy joy was replaced with a kind of weary resignation. Their fights became more frequent, their silences longer. He started spending more time at my place, seeking a kind of neutral territory where he didn't have to perform or pretend. He would show up with takeout, claiming he was in the neighborhood, and we would eat and talk about everything and nothing, carefully avoiding the growing fissure in the center of his life. I remember one evening, about a month before the final breakup, he was sitting on my floor, leaning against the couch, staring into the middle distance. He'd been quiet for a long time, just watching the city lights flicker to life outside my window. "Do you ever feel," he started, his voice low and thoughtful, "like you're playing a role you were never cast in? Like you're reading from a script someone else wrote for you, and you've forgotten all your lines?" I knew he was talking about his life with Clara, about the future everyone, including him, had assumed was already written. "Sometimes," I answered honestly. "I think everyone feels that way at some point," he nodded slowly, not looking at me. It's supposed to be easy, right? With the right person, it's supposed to feel like coming home. But lately, it feels like I'm constantly navigating a minefield. I'm so tired of watching every word I say." He finally turned his head to look at me, and his eyes were filled with a profound and startling loneliness. "It's easy with you, Leo. It's always been easy with you." That statement hung in the air between us, shimmering with unspoken meaning. It was a dangerous thing for him to say, and a more dangerous thing for me to hear. It was a crack in the careful facade of our platonic friendship, a glimpse of something deeper. I wanted to lean into it, to ask him what he meant, to confess that it was easy for me too because with him, I was already home. But I didn't. I couldn't. The risk was too great. Instead, I just offered him a small, sad smile and changed the subject. I steered us back into the safe, well-charted waters of our friendship. But the crack remained, and it was only a matter of time before the pressure became too much and the entire structure shattered. The night he told me it was officially over, his voice on the phone was hollow, an echo in an empty room. He didn't cry. He just sounded erased. He explained the logistics in a flat monotone. She was packing her things. He was staying at a hotel for a few days to give her space. They had divided up the furniture, the friends, the life they had built. It was a clinical, bloodless recitation of the dismemberment of a relationship. When he was done, there was a long silence on the line. I could hear his shallow breathing, the sound of a man trying to hold himself together with sheer force of will. "Do you want me to come get you?" I asked. "You can stay here." There was a pause. "No," he said, but his voice was uncertain. "No, I'm fine. I just needed to tell someone," but he wasn't fine. And a week later, he was on my doorstep, asking to come in, because the silence in his own apartment had become a monster. That first night, he didn't talk much. He just sat on my couch, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, and stared at the muted television. I made him tea, which he held in his hands until it grew cold, his knuckles white around the mug. I didn't push him to talk. I just sat in the armchair across from him, reading a book, providing a quiet, steady presence. My apartment became a sanctuary, a place where the only expectation was for him to breathe. Around midnight, his head started to nod, his body finally succumbing to the emotional exhaustion. "You should take the bed," I said softly. He shook his head, his movements sluggish. "No, the couch is fine. It's perfect." He curled up on his side, pulling the blanket tighter around him, and within minutes, he was asleep. I watched him for a long time, the rise and fall of his chest, the way his brow was furrowed even in sleep. I turned off the lights and went to my own room, but I left the door ajar. I found that I couldn't close it completely. I needed to be able to hear him, to know that he was still there, that he was okay. I lay in my own bed, listening to the unfamiliar sound of another person's breathing in my home, and I felt a profound and painful tenderness swell in my chest. It was the beginning of the ritual. The ritual became our new normal, an unspoken agreement that took root in the fertile ground of his grief and my quiet, patient love. It started with one night, then two. The second time, he texted me from work. "Long day. Don't want to go home to the ghost ship. Movie night at your place." It wasn't a question. It was a plea. That night, we ordered pizza and sat on the couch, a comfortable distance between us, and watched some mindless action movie. He started to talk, a little at first, then more. He talked about the small, stupid things he missed, the way Clara used to leave her teacups on every available surface, the sound of her blow dryer in the morning. He wasn't mourning the loss of a great love anymore. He was mourning the loss of a life, of a routine. He was a man adrift, and my apartment, my couch, had become his temporary port. That night, he fell asleep again before the movie was over. His head lolled to the side and came to rest on the cushion, inches from my shoulder. I sat perfectly still, my own breathing shallow, hyper-aware of his proximity. The air between us felt charged, thick with unspoken possibilities. I could smell the faint scent of his shampoo, something clean and green, like fresh-cut grass. After a few minutes, I carefully stood up, trying not to jostle him. I retrieved the same blanket from the night before and gently draped it over him. My fingers brushed against his arm, and his skin was warm. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through me, a current of longing so intense it almost buckled my knees. I retreated to my room, leaving the door ajar once more, my heart pounding a frantic, hopeful, terrified rhythm against my ribs. Over the next few weeks, the space between us on the couch began to shrink. It wasn't a conscious decision on either of our parts, more like a slow, gravitational pull. It would start with his foot brushing against mine, then an arm resting along the back of the couch behind me. Each new point of contact was a tiny, seismic event in my inner world. I would analyze it for hours, turning it over and over in my mind, searching for its meaning. Was it intentional? Was it just the casual, unthinking intimacy of a long friendship? Or was it something more? I was a detective searching for clues in a case where I was the only interested party. Julian, for his part, seemed completely oblivious. Or perhaps he was simply allowing himself a level of physical comfort he desperately needed, without questioning its implications. He was healing, and I was the balm. The first time he properly leaned on me, it felt like the world had tilted on its axis. We were halfway through a documentary about deep-sea exploration, and the narrator was talking about the immense pressure at the bottom of the ocean. Julian, who had been quiet for a while, let out a long, weary sigh and simply tilted. His head came to rest on my shoulder, a dead weight of trust and exhaustion. My entire body went rigid. I held my breath, waiting for him to realize what he'd done and pull away, maybe with an embarrassed laugh. But he didn't. He just settled in, his breathing evening out, his body relaxing against mine. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, a living statue with a warm, breathing man asleep on my shoulder. My mind was a chaotic storm of conflicting emotions. There was the pure, unadulterated joy of his closeness, a feeling I had fantasized about for years. It was a warmth that spread from the point of contact on my shoulder all through my chest, a quiet, glowing ember. But there was also a profound terror. This was a dangerous territory. It was a blurring of lines, a rewriting of the rules we had always silently abided by. This ritual of comfort was becoming something else, something more intimate and fragile. I was terrified that if I moved, if I even breathed wrong, I would shatter the spell. So I didn't move. I sat there until my own neck ached and my leg had fallen asleep, until the documentary ended and the credits rolled in silence. I just let him sleep, his head on my shoulder, and I tried to memorize the feeling, the weight of him, the quiet intimacy of the moment, convinced it would never happen again. But it did happen again. It became the new standard. Movie nights now implicitly included him falling asleep against me. The pretense of watching the movie at all slowly faded away. It was about proximity. It was about the quiet comfort of another human body in a world that had suddenly felt cold and empty to him. For me, it was a slow and exquisite form of torture. Every night was a tightrope walk between bliss and anxiety. I was so close to everything I had ever wanted, but it was a closeness born of his need, not his desire. Or so I told myself. I was the safe harbor, the steady friend. To assume it was anything more felt like a betrayal of his trust. The ritual escalated one cold November night. The heating in my building was on the fritz, and the apartment was drafty. We were huddled on the couch under a pile of blankets, watching the rain lash against the window panes. He was shivering slightly, even under the blankets. "I'm so cold," he mumbled, his teeth chattering. And then, without any warning, he shifted, turning towards me and wrapping his arms around my middle, burying his face in my chest. He wasn't asleep this time. He was wide awake. My heart stopped. I was sure of it. For a solid 10 seconds, there was no air in my lungs, no blood in my veins. He was holding me, intentionally. His arms were wrapped around me, his cheek was pressed against my sweater, and I could feel the warmth of his breath through the fabric. "Is this okay?" he whispered, his voice muffled. "Just for a minute. I'm just really cold." I couldn't find my voice. I could only manage a nod, a jerky, awkward movement. I slowly, tentatively, raised my own arms and wrapped them around him, holding him in a loose, uncertain embrace. He sighed, a sound of deep contentment, and snuggled closer, his body molding against mine. We stayed like that for a long time, not speaking, just listening to the sound of the rain and our own breathing. My mind, usually a raging torrent of analysis and what-ifs, went completely silent. There was no room for thought. There was only the overwhelming, all-encompassing reality of him in my arms. It wasn't about comfort anymore, not just his. It was about a shared warmth, a mutual seeking of solace from the cold, both outside and in. The line I had been so afraid of crossing had been obliterated. We had drifted into a new, uncharted ocean, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the depth. I was only afraid that the morning would come, and he would swim back to shore, leaving me alone in the water. The crossing happened on a Thursday. It was an unremarkable day that became the most remarkable day of my life. The ritual was so ingrained in our lives by this point that it no longer required an invitation. Julian came over after work, we made dinner together, and we settled onto the couch. But something was different that night. The air was still, heavy with a tension I couldn't name. He was quiet, but it wasn't his usual tired quiet. It was a watchful, deliberate silence. He didn't turn on the television. We just sat there, side by side, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of city traffic. He was staring at his hands, which were clasped in his lap. I watched the way his thumbs traced patterns over his knuckles, a nervous, repetitive motion. The silence stretched, growing tauter with every passing second. I felt a familiar anxiety begin to creep in, the fear that I had done something wrong, that he had finally realized the true nature of my feelings and was about to pull away, to end this strange, intimate chapter of our lives. I was preparing myself for the impact, bracing for the inevitable heartbreak. Leo. His voice was so soft I almost didn't hear it. I turned to look at him. He had finally lifted his head, and he was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It was a mixture of vulnerability and fear and a kind of raw, desperate honesty. It stripped away all his usual defenses, all the easy charm and casual confidence. In that moment, he was just Julian, scared and uncertain, and my heart ached for him. "Yeah," I managed to say, my own voice barely a whisper. "Is this okay?" he asked, and his gaze flickered between my eyes and the small space of couch cushion separating us. He wasn't just asking about tonight. He was asking about all of it. About the nights on the couch, the borrowed warmth, the heads on shoulders, the arms wrapped around chests. He was asking about the new language we had created, a language of touch and proximity that we had never dared to translate into words. He was asking for confirmation that he hadn't imagined it, that this space we had carved out was real. And in that moment, I had a choice. I could retreat. I could give him the easy, platonic answer. I could say, "Of course, we're friends." I could reinforce the boundary, rebuild the wall, and shove all my own feelings back into their locked room. It would be the safe thing to do. It would preserve our friendship, the foundation upon which my entire adult life was built. Or I could tell the truth. I could take the biggest risk of my life. I took a breath. "It's okay," I said, and I let all the meaning, all the years of unspoken affection, pour into those two simple words. I held his gaze, not letting him look away. I wanted him to see the truth in my eyes. "It is more than okay. It is everything." He seemed to sag with relief, a tension I hadn't even noticed in his shoulders releasing all at once. He nodded slowly, a small, grateful gesture. A beat of silence passed, then another. He didn't break eye contact. The intensity of his stare made my skin prickle. He was searching for something, and I prayed he would find it. Then, he leaned in, just a fraction of an inch. "Would it be okay," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly, "if I kissed you?" The world stopped. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. The question was a gift, an offering of profound respect and vulnerability. He wasn't assuming. He wasn't taking. He was asking. He was giving me all the power, the choice to open the final door or to keep it locked forever. The sound of my own blood roaring in my ears was the only thing I could hear. The locked room inside me wasn't just creaking open anymore. The door had been blown off its hinges, and everything I had kept hidden for so long was flooding out. I didn't trust myself to speak, so I just nodded. A single, decisive dip of my chin. "Yes." He closed the remaining distance between us with an agonizing slowness. It was a kiss born not of passion, but of trepidation and discovery. His lips were soft, hesitant against mine, a question being asked in a language older than words. I responded in kind, a gentle pressure, an answer of acceptance. It was a quiet, reverent thing, a confession shared in the space between one breath and the next. It lasted only a few seconds, but it contained the entire 6-year history of our friendship, all the unspoken yearning, all the carefully concealed hope. When he pulled back, he didn't go far. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. I could feel his breath on my lips, warm and shaky. We stayed like that, breathing each other in the silent, trembling aftermath of a boundary crossed, a truth finally acknowledged. Nothing had been said, but everything had changed. The aftermath was a deafening silence. The morning after the kiss, I woke up alone. The apartment was still and quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. It was an empty, hollow silence, filled with the ghost of the night before. Julian was gone. The blanket we had shared was folded neatly on the arm of the couch. The coffee mug he had used was washed and sitting in the drying rack by the sink. It was as if he had meticulously erased all evidence of his presence, not just from my apartment, but from the fragile new reality we had created. A single text message on my phone was the only proof that it had happened at all. It was sent at 6 in the morning. Had to run, early meeting. Talk later, but he didn't talk later. The day passed in a thick fog of anxiety. I checked my phone 100 times, my stomach twisting into a tighter knot with every hour of silence. I replayed the kiss over and over in my mind, a forensic investigator examining a crime scene. Had I imagined the tenderness? Had I misinterpreted the vulnerability in his question? Had I pushed him into something he wasn't ready for? My hope, which had soared to such dizzying heights the night before, came crashing down, leaving me bruised and disoriented. The quiet observer in me went into overdrive, analyzing every possible nuance, every potential meaning behind his silence, and every conclusion I reached was more painful than the last. He regretted it. He was disgusted. He was scared. He had made a mistake, and now he was trying to figure out how to undo it without completely destroying our friendship. The silence stretched for 3 days. 3 days of unanswered texts and calls sent straight to voicemail. It was a special kind of hell, a limbo of uncertainty. The comfort of our ritual was gone, replaced by a gaping void. My apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a mausoleum, a monument to a beautiful, fleeting moment that had died as soon as the sun came up. The ache in my chest was a physical presence, a constant, dull pressure that made it hard to breathe. I had risked everything for that one moment of honesty, and it seemed I had lost. I hadn't just lost the potential for something more. I had lost the friendship that was the bedrock of my world. The silence wasn't just the absence of his voice. It was the sound of him erasing me. On the 4th day, I couldn't take it anymore. The not knowing was infinitely worse than any truth he could tell me. I needed to look him in the eye. I needed to hear the words, whatever they were. So I did something I had never done before. I went to his apartment unannounced. As I stood outside his door, my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. My hand was shaking as I raised it to knock. This was it. The confrontation. The end. He opened the door after a long moment, and he looked terrible. He was pale, with dark circles under his eyes, and he was wearing the same sweatshirt I'd seen him in 4 days ago. He looked surprised to see me, then a wave of something else, guilt, fear, sorrow, washed over his face. He didn't meet my eyes. He just stood there, one hand on the doorknob, blocking the entrance. "Julian," I said, and my voice was steadier than I expected. "You have to talk to me." He shook his head, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Leo, I can't. Not right now, no," I said, and a surge of desperate strength flowed through me. I would not be dismissed. I would not let him hide. "Now? You don't get to do that. You don't get to kiss me like that, and then just disappear. You owe me more than that. Our friendship deserves more than that." The word friendship tasted like ash in my mouth, but it was the only leverage I had. He finally looked up at me, and his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. He looked utterly broken. He stepped back, pulling the door open, a silent admission of defeat. I walked into his apartment. It was a mess. Clothes were strewn over chairs. Takeout containers littered the coffee table. The air was stale and sad. It was the apartment of a man who had completely come undone. He sank down onto his own couch, the one he had been fleeing for weeks, and buried his face in his hands. His shoulders shook with a silent sob. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my anger evaporating, replaced by a wave of overwhelming empathy. I crossed the room and sat down beside him, not touching him, just closing the distance. After a long moment, he took a shuddering breath and lifted his head. "I'm so sorry, Leo," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I'm such a coward. Just tell me why," I said softly. "Was it a mistake? Do you regret it?" He shook his head vehemently, his eyes wide and earnest. "No. God, no. That's the problem. It wasn't a mistake." He took another shaky breath, struggling to find the words. "Leo, when I kissed you, it was the first thing that's felt real in months. It was like coming up for air after being underwater for a long time. It felt right. And that's what terrified me." He looked away, staring at the far wall as he spoke, as if the confession was too raw to make while looking at me. "All my life, I've had this plan, this map. You go to school, you get a job, you find a nice girl, you get married. I was following the map. With Clara, I was following the map. And even when I was miserable, I kept following it, because it was the only map I had. And then, there was you. You were never on the map. You were this separate place, this place I could go where I didn't have to pretend, where things were just easy." He paused, swallowing hard. "That night, when I asked if I could kiss you, it felt like I was stepping off the map completely, into this totally unknown territory. And the kiss, it felt more like home than anything I had ever known. And I panicked. Because what does that mean? What does it mean that the thing that feels most right in the entire world is the one thing I never, ever expected? I've never felt this way about a guy before, Leo. I don't know what to do with it. I don't know who I am anymore." He finally turned back to me, his face a canvas of confusion and fear and a fragile, burgeoning hope. "I ran away because I was scared," he said, his voice cracking. "I was scared of how much it meant. And I was scared that if I stayed, I would mess it up, say the wrong thing, and I would lose you completely. And I can't. I can't lose you, Leo. You're everything." His confession hung in the air, a beautiful, terrifying, honest thing. All my fears, all my anxieties, all the painful stories I had told myself over the past 4 days, they all dissolved in the face of his raw, clumsy, heartfelt truth. He hadn't been running from me. He had been running from himself, from the overwhelming power of a feeling he didn't understand. He hadn't been trying to erase me. He had been terrified of losing me. And in that moment, all the pain of the last few days melted away, and all that was left was love. A deep, quiet, patient love, not just for the man I wanted him to be, but for the scared, confused, wonderfully human man sitting right in front of me. The resolution did not arrive like a thunderclap, but like the slow, gentle light of dawn after a long and difficult night. After his confession, we just sat there on his couch, the space between us no longer a chasm of misunderstanding, but a quiet field of shared vulnerability. We started to talk, really talk, for the first time. All the things that had been locked away behind closed doors and communicated only through hesitant touch were finally brought out into the light. He told me about the loneliness he'd felt even when he was with Clara, a sense of being fundamentally misunderstood. I told him about the day in the library, 6 years ago, when I first realized I loved him, and how I had carefully packed that love away, content to live on the sustenance of his friendship alone. There were tears, both his and mine. There was a kind of astonished laughter at the years we had spent orbiting each other, both of us too scared to admit the truth. It was a conversation that unraveled years of knots, that smoothed out the crumpled pages of our shared history. He wasn't a man with a map anymore. He was just a man, holding my hand, admitting he was lost, and asking if maybe we could find a new direction together. His fear didn't magically disappear, nor did my years of carefully constructed self-protection. But we had named the fear, and in doing so, we had robbed it of its power. The monster in the dark was just a shadow after all. That night, I didn't go back to my apartment. I stayed with him, but we didn't fall asleep on the couch. When we were both too tired to talk anymore, he stood up and held out his hand to me. "Come on," he said softly. He led me to his bedroom, a room I had only ever glimpsed from the hallway. It was the first time we had ever crossed that threshold together. There was no pretext, no excuse of being cold or tired. It was a conscious choice, a deliberate act of intention. He closed the bedroom door behind us, and the quiet click of the latch was one of the most reassuring sounds I had ever heard. The door wasn't left ajar as a tentative sign of hope. It was closed, securing us together in a new, private world of our own making. We didn't do anything more than sleep, but that sleep was more intimate than anything that had come before. We lay facing each other in the dark, his hand holding mine on the pillow between us. There was no anxiety, no overanalysis, no fear of misinterpretation. There was just the simple, profound peace of being exactly where I was supposed to be. I watched the rise and fall of his chest, listened to the sound of his breathing, no longer an unfamiliar presence in my home, but the steady, comforting rhythm of my own. For the first time, the quiet observer in my head went silent. There was nothing left to analyze. There was only this. There was only us. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee. I opened my eyes and found Julian standing by the bed, holding 2 mugs. He was smiling, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes, and it was like seeing the sun for the first time after a long winter. "I thought you might need this," he said. I sat up and took the mug from him, our fingers brushing. The simple, domestic act felt monumental. It was the start of a new kind of ritual, one built on honesty and choice, not on unspoken need and ambiguity. We began to build our new life in the quiet spaces, in the small, everyday moments. We made breakfast together. We cleaned up his apartment, a symbolic act of clearing out the old grief to make room for something new. Later that day, we went back to my place to get some of my things. As we stood in my living room, Julian looked at the couch, our old sanctuary and battleground, and a soft, wistful expression crossed his face. He walked over to it and ran his hand along the back. "We spent a lot of time here," he said. "We did," I agreed. He turned to me, his expression serious. "Thank you, Leo," he said, "for letting me fall apart here, for being patient with me, for everything." He stepped towards me and wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into a hug that was solid and sure and utterly free of doubt. I buried my face in his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, and I held on tight. He was the best friend I had almost lost, the one I had spent years loving in silence. But in that moment, he was simply mine, and I was his. There are moments in your life that are not disguised at all. They arrive with the clarity of a perfectly focused photograph, sharp and true in every detail. They are not the beginning of the story, but the culmination of it. They are the quiet mornings making coffee, the sound of a key turning in a lock that now feels like it belongs to both of you, the comfortable silence of 2 people reading side by side on a couch that is no longer a temporary refuge but a shared home. Love, I learned, is not always a grand, sweeping gesture. Sometimes, it is a slow and patient process, like an image developing in a darkroom, emerging gradually from the shadows until it is finally, breathtakingly, clear. And as we stood there in my apartment, holding each other, I knew that we had finally stepped out of the darkness and into the beautiful, honest light we had learned to create together.